Markets. So, question. Winning from opening government can be anything. But what do you feel like? What do people want? Do you know what you would like to talk about tonight? Is anyone dying for a particular kind of session? A bit more on case prep? Yep.
How to know you're hitting the key issues.
Okay, key issues. Good. Alright, well let's throw out some ideas. I mean, if you want to win from opening government, what do you think you actually need to do? So maybe hitting the key issues is a good one. Any ideas? Wow. Has anyone ever won from opening government? Okay. So, hitting on key ideas. Any other thoughts?
You need to build up a strong enough case that it can withstand the closing half of the debate.
Okay. So, let's be fancy. A resilient case. 2 words. What other words can we throw when we're debaters?
Staying engaged.
Sorry?
Staying engaged.
Oh, staying engaged. Yep. Sweet. How do you do those things?
It's just set the debate up well. Even
Yeah.
Not necessarily as how you do those things, but sorry, just...
No, this is a fair point. So I'm going to say frame it. And, yeah. Okay, good. So there's some ideas. We're getting thinking. We're a little slow to warm up today, but we'll get there. Just a warning, if we don't get more engagement, I get people to stand up and just singing it. Balls in your court. Just saying. Okay, so I think in my mind, a lot of this is really right. So I think for opening government, the key is the debate's going to move on without you, and you have to be part of it. And that's really the key from being the opener. So how do you put such a control and such a stamp on the debate that the debate is always about your stuff and about what you want it to be, and it can actually never get away from you? And really, at its core, that just means doing good debating. But it means thinking about a couple of things in particular along the way. So why don't we just talk about all of them? And if you're enjoying something, we'll keep doing it. If we're not, we'll move on. So I'm going to talk about openings. I'm going to talk about lines. Some of these will be familiar, and where they are, you're going to teach me. Talk about models.
Sure. Yeah.
We'll talk about the killer case, which we were asked, key issues. We'll talk about resilient arguments. And then we might talk about teamwork as well. Outrageous, I know. Okay, so let's start with openings because it's fun. So, an honest question. How often do you think the Prime Minister's speech is the most boring speech in the debate? Does it ever feel hard when you get up to start? So we have our first volunteer. So we're going to do openings. We're going to do exercises for everything today. Everyone's going to participate. So let's talk about openings for a second. Opening at Prime Minister and opening government in general is hard because you have to create the momentum, right? You've got nothing to react to. Any other position in a debate, you can get angry, you can get righteous, you can get outraged, right? Whether because they said something actually just stupid and then you can be like, ha! Or just because you get fired up by hearing the outrage and all builds. You've got something to react to at any other position in the debate. But at Prime Minister, you don't. You have to create your own momentum. Right? And so often, the reason, dare I say it, that I think adjudicators often score first staffs or Prime Ministers lower is just because they don't find them very exciting from the start. Right? So to do a really good OG and have an impact, you need to create that excitement right from the start. So what are some ways to do that? One is to think, why the hell are we debating this? Why does anybody care? Do you ever think about that when you get a topic? So I'm going to throw out a topic. So this game is called Find the Context. Okay? And what we're looking for is a reason to care. So a couple of tips. Reasons you might care, because something really fucking bad is happening right now, and you can stop it. Right? So this is what we might call a tipping point. People come across that concept before? Right? Now's the chance to act or things get worse. It might be because of a trend. right? Well, it's not necessarily going to be much worse tomorrow, but it's bad today, so we should just deal with it now before it gets even worse. Or it might be just because you've decided that now's time to do something about something that you've always wanted to do something about, and we've just never dealt with it before. But your challenge is to find a case, find a reason to care. So, first topic is going to be that America should launch retaliatory missile strikes on Syria. Okay. Why would we debate that? Why would we care?
Because something really bad is happening that we should do something about.
There's a tipping point. If we don't, we have to act now and there's a short amount of time. Yeah.
Okay. So tipping point, what? What's going to happen if we don't?
Then they might use chemical weapons again. Or people might think it's normal to use chemical weapons in the future conflicts.
Awesome. So what you're doing there already is building an urgency, right? So make this case, right? We're here proposing retaliatory strikes on Bashar al-Assad because if we don't act now, he'll believe that he can get away with anything. And the chance that he'll use chemical weapons again goes higher every day we wait, right? Something like that. And then you frame the context instead. Let's try something a little harder. So, this House would give more votes to citizens according to their performance on a citizenship exam. I'll leave you right.
So the imperative being that some people are stupid, and stupid people have a disproportionate impact on policy, on the way that elections run, which dumbs down the process of making policy and therefore makes the actual process of government worse.
So you've given a great argument, but it does feel a little bit like, what I'm asking for is, what's the context? Why would anyone bring this up aside from intellectual masturbation?
So maybe you're looking at this election and you say there's the popularity of all these fringe parties and this is a negative effect, and you think that in a society where, according to intelligence, whatever the prompt was, you got more votes, these fringe parties would not be such an issue.
Okay, that's one way to do it. So you think the problem in this election is fringe parties?
Yeah.
Who thinks there's a different problem in this election? Yeah, what's your version of the problem?
Basically the fact that Tony Abbott to a larger extent, but also Kevin Rudd, are just literally saying really stupid things with an incredible amount of regularity, hoping that people will believe them.
Awesome, so now you're painting a context where you're saying Australians this weekend are going to face the worst choice we've ever had in history. This is what our democracy has come to. And do you know what's happening? They're saying dumb shit in the hope that dumb people will believe them. And that's destroying politics for everyone in this country. Well, guess what topic we've just been asked to debate? We've actually been asked to debate about a way to make politicians not say dumb shit to dumb people, but actually to put real policy on the table so that our country gets the leaders, maybe not that it deserves, but that it should have. Right? Yeah.
I can't believe you mentioned Clark Palmer.
Absolutely. So, you know, you've got two different angles here, right? So we're working the minority crazies angle, or the fact that the mainstream is being pulled to this. And so, I mean, my example here is a little crazy, but can you see how what I'm trying to do is say, actually, you can always find something going on and create a context that ties it. And so it's not just, this is a good idea because, there's a reason, there's a reason we care. And that gives you something to react to in your mind. And you can get passionate about that, right? It's very hard to just get passionate about something that's entirely abstract and come from nowhere. So let's try one more. Which one was I going to do? Okay. Cool. This house applauds the rise of songs by female pop artists that glorify assertive female sexuality. Right? Simplifier, we're proud of pro-female sexuality pop stars. Anyone think of a reason why you could get up and be excited? Something you could react to on this? Yeah.
Conventional, what do you call that? Hip-hop music is extremely misogynistic.
Yep. So that's true. So you want to counter that perception, right? So you get up and say, is there a trend, or is this just something it's time we addressed?
It's getting even worse.
Minus trend.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, one way to do it, right? You can do that. It's okay to say, look, we live in a society where this misogynistic, hateful rap has just become normalized. And we have to break that, right? And that's why we're proposing this. Or you could pick a particular context. So Miley Cyrus, what's Miley Cyrus got to do with this?
So she's a young pop star who is not necessarily, you can take it either way. You can say that you need to take people who have defined their sexuality and she's one of those people and characterise her as someone who has taken control of their sexuality, or characterise her as someone who has just taken the sexuality that society has told that she should have.
It's also more about the vitriolic response that the internet had to that video and what that demonstrates about society.
Okay, so how would that link to the topic? So I'm going to give you 30 seconds. In fact, this is your challenge, everyone. I'm probably just going to call them, but you don't know who it's going to be. 30 seconds, think about how would you make an intro that got you to the topic. Okay, so I want you to start something about Miley Cyrus, outrage, getting to, and that's why we believe this, right? That's why we believe that we should applaud the rise of pro-female sexuality pop stars. Okay, 30 seconds, I think. Probably only need like 2 sentences to get there.
I guess you'd say.
Don't I guess? Do like it's enough.
The response that the internet had to a recent video of Miley Cyrus's terrible gyrations on stage is demonstrative of the fact that society has a really negative view towards female pop stars, and therefore we should applaud the rise of empowered female pop stars like Lady Gaga because they have the capacity to change society's views.
Okay. Good try. Anyone want to try? Anyone want to try it differently? Anyone want to give a shot?
Can I use a slightly different example?
Not yet.
Well, you can just dress up the language more. So something along the lines of the internet's reaction to Miley Cyrus's performance at the VMAs shows a deep-seated cultural hatred towards the idea of female sexuality. This is an outrage, and it's something that we have to address. And we absolutely support every pop singer in their attempts to try and create an ideal of female sexuality that is empowered, that is pervasive in our society, and is normal as something that women can enjoy as part of their life. It's momentum.
So you've added one thing to our discussion. We've talked about find a context, right, that you can react to, right? Talk about some trends, find some tipping points, but yeah, use visceral language, right? Find something that actually taps into people. Taps that in this context. Yeah. And I might even push and say you can go one further, right? In this, the vitriolic outrage that was directed at Miley Cyrus for doing nothing more than celebrating her sexiness on stage is an outrage. We should be applauding Miley Cyrus for what she did on that stage, for taking ownership of her sexuality and dominating it at the MTV Music Awards. Miley, you rock, girl. And that's why we're here to say, this is good for feminism. This is good for society. We're pro-Miley. This is our case, right? So, you know, like, find it, own it. And these are not topics that are linked to that. Miley was after this topic was written, right? But these topics, somehow, it seems like we can find things that are relevant. We'll do one last one, just because this is fun. This house would require international development aid budgets to be approved by popular referenda. This house would require development aid budgets to be approved by popular referenda. Whose first reaction to this is, what the hell is the context? My first reaction. So that's the thing. Have a think, 30 seconds. See if you can find something that people care about in today's world that you could tie this to.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
I was thinking Egypt.
Oh yeah, you can just find any humanitarian conflicts. People support.
What do people think about the uprising in Egypt?
This time,
Do we support a military coup?
Continue speaking up.
So, someone from over this side, any thoughts on what you could tie it to? There's no wrong answer. Anything?
USA to Egypt, for example.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, so one way to ground it would be in a political context where aid is being spent in ways that might be objectionable to people. Cool. We can think of a different type of context.
Again, amount of aid.
So, yeah.
Like, you know, how much aid does the general population think should be spent?
Yeah, no, good point. But why would people care? Why would people care about giving away too much aid?
Because they think they're being directly, they're not receiving the benefits that they should when they're citizens of the country, and they're the ones who made that money in the first place.
Cool. So now you're saying there's something here about our tax money should belong to us, our country. But is there any context in which tax becomes very sensitive? Big countries, let's take ourselves out of Australia, because even though we think we're running massive deficits, we're fine. But are there countries in the world that might actually have reason to be concerned about sending tax money overseas?
Every country but Australia.
Yeah, or China.
Yeah.
Can you frame it in terms of, like, particularly in countries like, I mean, my initial thought was Australia and the fact that we haven't solved poverty amongst the indigenous population, or America hasn't cleaned up after New Orleans or stuff like that. Like, there are still disadvantaged members of our own population that we haven't looked after, and that's what it's meant to be about.
I think you absolutely could. So we've heard there are a few different ideas. One, you could ground this whole debate about aid referenda on saying we have problems in our own backyard that we just have to deal with. Why do you bring that up now? Because it's time to recognize it, right? But you could equally say this is actually just about, in a context of running deficits that are going to cripple our countries, it's unconscionable to actually be sending money overseas when we can't even afford our own country, right? So just hopefully you've seen across these 4 topics, it doesn't really matter what topic there is in the world. You can find something, what topic you get. You can find something going on in the world that someone cares about that you can link that topic to. Right? And if you can do that, you can create some sort of spark, some sort of emotion, something to react to. And that's going to give you a really powerful thing, because it's very easy, honestly, if OG gets up and talks in very philosophical terms about something, and then a closing team just grounds it in a real context that's maybe a little bit different from your philosophy, the debate will move away, right? But if you can ground your debate in a real issue that real people care about, it's actually very hard for anyone to just move the debate away from you completely. Because as long as the debate's about a relevant issue, it's relevant. It doesn't disappear, right? So, I mean, this sounds like openings are just like a fancy mana trick, but it's not. It's actually much more than that. It's about grounding yourself in relevance for the whole debate by linking your case to a real world issue that you care about. Okay, so lines and models, you guys probably know about, yeah? So can someone explain what your team line is, or what lines are? Anyone in people in first year, have you done lines and models?
No, not explicitly.
No? Okay. Sweet. Alright, then someone hold the pants.
So one of the ways we look at team lines is whether or not you're doing a hard or strong or weak line in terms of the type of case you're running, whether it's the watered down version of what's being proposed, or whether it's the really, really crazy version, but often easier to prove you're fixing something version of the line.
Cool. So let's say our motion was this house would punish Assad for using chemical weapons. Walk this theme all the way through, okay? Punish Assad. Who can tell me what would be, someone who hasn't come across this concept before, but the words should give you a sense. We're going to be really hard-ass about this, really hard-liners. What might you propose?
Assassination.
Assassination? Can you go harder?
Stone him.
Stone him? Wow. You guys are really taking this punish Assad personally. So somewhere here, I mean, yeah, this is like the Assad vendetta point. You know, Chinese rice torture, like the bamboo stuff and the water and all sorts of things. Okay, but let's say we couldn't actually get to him that easily because he's probably got, you know, a fortress and stuff. It might actually be hard to kill Assad. As Maddie used to love saying in debates, we tried to kill
Castro.
with swan pelicans with bombs on them, and we still didn't kill him. So it's actually very hard to assassinate powerful
She did
people.
used to love to say that.
It's more an example of being desperate to assassinate him.
But it's hard, desperate, because you couldn't do it any other way. Okay, so let's say we want to do really hard. I mean, we're going to punish the Assad regime. Okay, so this is what we call extreme. Like, really hard. This is nuke.
Come on.
Tunisia.
What are they teaching you? Go back to Oxford.
Okay. What? Like I study public policy.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's extreme. And then what about carpet bomb Damascus? Is that like reasonable hardline or still extreme? Still extreme. Still extreme. Okay. So it's probably less extreme than nukes. What about an eye for an eye, chemical weapons? Also over here. Okay. What do you think? Let's go the other extreme. What's so soft that it's also like
Send him an angry letter. Correct.
So this is the Hans Blix solution. Okay? Hans Blix, like, write a letter. In fact, when you get so soft that you're at the letter writing point, you're actually at what we already know is called the status quo. Because,
boom!
well, truth be told, Obama's even been like threatening in the press. I mean, that's like, that's like a really angry letter on a press release, right? Okay, so we've worked out, I mean, who thinks you could win a debate running that or that?
Probably more likely to win the extremely hard line, surely.
Yeah. Okay, so what happens if you're opening government and you propose sending an angry letter to Assad? Yeah, because everyone will blame you for destroying the debate.
Frame. They will frame you. This is being recorded, Victor.
And what can you actually argue? I mean, seriously, what can you argue here? Why, what are we achieving by sending an angry letter? He killed thousands of children who died in agony from forbidden chemical weapons. We'll send him an angry letter. Right? Yeah, like, I don't know how your closing team's going to win, but they'll find something better than that. Let's say you go over here, right? You say nuke Damascus. Okay? What's going on? Who thinks you can win that?
Yeah.
What might be the problem there?
Killing civilians.
Okay, so what was the problem we were trying to fix?
Killing civilians.
The fact he was killing civilians. And how many civilians was he killing?
1,400.
Okay, and how many would we be killing?
All.
Okay. Alright. So let's not do that. Kill all like what's in the middle? Someone throw me some things that you might actually debate.
Economic
sanctions. Okay, sanctions. Hard or soft?
Soft.
Okay, but not like on status quo, kind of, but a little more. Maybe they're really hard sanctions.
No fly zone.
Hard sanctions. Okay, no fly zone. Yo, harder or softer than hard sanctions? No fly zone. Okay, what else?
Capture him and put him on trial.
Sorry?
Capture him and put him on trial in The Hague.
Yo, that's kind of on a parallel path of just really fucking difficult. I mean, great solution. But you might struggle to capture him.
2 days of bombing.
There was a famous debate at Worlds in 2008, which was this house would assassinate Vladimir Putin. And it was famous as being the most biased debate results ever at the end of the round. Because OG struggled with two things. One, they struggled to show why Putin was actually so bad he should be assassinated before other people like this. And two, you couldn't really show how you were actually going to get to Putin. Because he does own.
What's the soft line
the
on that?
only army in the world that has enough nukes to destroy America back. Okay. So yeah, I mean, we could try and propose capture. Let's be simple, and we're gonna, punish the Assad regime because he's not doing it alone. Okay, so what's some harder stuff?
Full-scale strikes against the regime's strongholds, their military installations, their air.
Alright. So way over here was ground invasion. Okay, somewhere over here is like airstrikes, big time. And what's Obama talking about?
Target airstrikes.
Okay. Kind of targeted airstrikes, whatever that means.
Would you put on the spectrum like funding the rebels? Like, could you put on the spectrum like funding the rebels and things?
Let's do that. Let's maybe somewhere over
It's a
here.
shit one because
No, but if you fund the rebels, you get the same problem. as-
exactly, it's a shit model,
Yeah.
but it's still an
Good.
it needs it.
So anyway,
This is debating law.
what I'm going to say here, two things. One, if you think there's a really, really big problem, in general, you better going hard or soft. Right. And if you think the problem is fairly small and fairly moderate,
Hard.
no, right? So in general, there's a sense of here of proportionality, right? So you might have heard problem solution gap, or not, but this is the idea. This is what it's getting at. That in some ways, your solution should be proportional to the problem you're dealing with, right? It's just a really good rule of thumb to think: would a real person outside of debate actually think this might be reasonable? Right? Now, actually, you're asking yourself that, but you're just putting a different hat on. It's amazing to come up with different answers, and it's cool. So, as a general rule, with something like this is a particularly tricky case because it's actually hard to show that any of the hard lines would actually achieve anything. But as a general rule, the harder you go, the clearer your principles, right? Saying this is a bad man, who's done bad stuff, and we need to do whatever it takes under the responsibility to protect people. It's really easy to argue those principles if you run hard. If you go softer, you're running a slightly more realpolitik line. You're saying, unfortunately, we can't stop Assad, right? But we can at least try and minimize the worst excesses. Right? So you see, like, even how I'm framing this. If I wanted to run a softer thing, like targeted airstrikes or sanctions, even from OG, I might own already that we're not going to get rid of Assad. We're not actually going to change the regime. No one's going to do that. I just concede that up front, right? But I think what we can do is at least minimize the barbarism and the unnecessary civilian casualties. So I'm saying there's only a small thing we can influence, so I use a small thing over here. But if you wanted to get up there and say this is a disgraceful tyrant who we need to topple and get out, then you need to run a hard line over there. The reason that a line is important to think about explicitly when you're prepping as OG is because you need to know what you're proposing in order to know what arguments to run, right? Which is kind of like just what I said before, right? So if you're kind of thinking you're proposing something pretty hardcore, do you or do you not want to run an argument that you would be able to topple the Assad regime? Yeah. Right. If you're running something a bit softer, like target airstrikes or sanctions, do you or do you not want to rank the case that you'll actually successfully topple the Assad regime? Why wouldn't you?
Because then it's really easy to argue that won't work.
Right. So
Because
you
you're
could
conceding
just not run that argument because you think you can't win it, right? And choose to focus your case on the bit you think you can win, which is a very pessimistic but realist case, a la the Obama case at the moment, about just trying to minimize the use of the worst weapons of war, right?
Yeah, should you try and pick a line that you think the other debaters afterwards will most likely think will be debated, because then it's more likely that what you bring will be what's debated later on. And if you bring something really hard and everyone else is prepared for a softer debate, they're going to bring all these soft arguments out and your material will fall out.
I mean, in general, you should not try and trick anyone with a line. You should run the line that you think is the case that you like the way the bits fit together. And as a general rule, going a little bit harder is going to be cleaner and easier. It's hard to say what would happen in that case, right? If you went really hard and everyone tried to be soft, despite the fact your proposal was hard, they might become irrelevant because they're not actually talking about what was proposed in the debate.
Yes.
Right? But if you go too soft and it gets pointed out that what you're proposing is irrelevant, it moves on. So I just think the key is you have to agree quite early in code what you're doing because the line has implications, right? You can't run ground invasion and run we don't think we can get rid of Assad, right? If you're doing ground invasion, you have to run an argument about getting rid of Assad. Otherwise, there's no point, right? But if you don't think you can get rid of Assad, then you can run arguments over here. The key is recognizing up front that there are implications to the choices you make and making that consciously. And that's, again, another big thing. When debates move away from opening teams, sometimes it's not because they were relevant, it's just because they were confused, right? And they said them things that were a little bit in tension with each other, right? So they initially proposed this, but then they backtracked a little bit. They didn't want to actually say they could successfully defend toppling Assad or whatever. And suddenly you propose something hard, but you can't really show it, and then you're out of the debate. It's irrelevant. So explicitly recognizing the line that you choose and the implications that come with it is critical to nailing it from opening. All right, let's talk about models. So, what is a model?
Your proposal for fixing whatever the question is.
Yeah, so it's like a little bit of extra detail, right? The tangible mechanism of how it's going to happen. How much model do you want?
Piece of string.
Not too much.
Right. Yeah, Goldilocks model. Yeah, so, okay, so what does your model do for you, tactically?
Shuts arguments down.
Okay, shuts them down. How so?
Like you can't argue against us doing something wrong if we've said we're not going to do that thing.
Okay, great. So,
Push it up.
Push it down.
Push it up, push it down.
Push it up, push it down. And then you can get the
okay, great. So models, what we're saying is a model actually is not just detail you provide because you feel you have to provide it. A model actually does something for you. It decides what things you're actually going to defend and what you're not by giving a little bit more detail about your proposal. Right? If you don't give detail about what you're proposing, it's fair enough sometimes for other people to assume that that would mean certain things, whatever. So, apologies for people who've heard this case, but we'll just do it because it's fun. This was the 2005 World's Grand Final. People who won from OG in a very interesting debate. The topic was, this house would legalize corporal punishment in schools. So, corporal smacking, not capital. Legalize corporal punishment in schools. And they sat there in opening up and they thought, if we're not clever on this, we're going to lose because there are so many ways for corporal punishment to be abused. Okay, so someone throw out an argument. Well, let's say we're sitting here thinking about a model, right? We want to bring it back into schools. What are arguments that we do have to deal with?
Abuse.
Abuse? Well, so let me say, what are the things we can't rule out with our model?
That a kid will be hit.
Okay, great. So we are actually going to hit kids, right? What else are we going to have to defend? Certain cases where that hitting will be authorized and used, whatever. The key thing that we're saying here is you can't model yourself out of the debate. You have to be careful. That's why I want to start with this one. You have to recognize you still have to debate the core debate, right? But you don't have to defend certain things. So you say, if we're proposing corporal punishment, yes, we will defend hitting kids for many different reasons. Okay, and it's going to fucking hurt, right? Otherwise there's no point. Okay, but what are some other objections to corporal punishment?
Abuse of power.
Abuse of power. Okay, do we want to defend abuse of power or not? Okay, we won't. Abuse of power. What else?
Psychological trauma.
Psych trauma. Why would they get psych trauma? Because they were like abused in front of their friends, shamed in front of their peers, maybe something like that. Okay. What else? Yeah.
Overuse.
Overuse. Yeah. Like to the point it actually does like lasting harm.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else?
Like
Like sexual perverts doing it, right? Sexual abuse mixed in, private spanking room. You don't want to have to deal with that, right? But honestly, if you just get up and you say, hey, we're all for teachers punishing the kids however they want to do it. Because we believe in corporal punishment in schools. There's going to be some teachers who interpret that in different ways, right? Okay, what else? Anything else?
Could be used arbitrarily.
Arbitrariness, yeah. It's maybe a little bit like this, but yeah. What else?
I don't know if it falls into one of the others, but like not cruel or unusual. So standardization.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe a fairness point, right? That there should be some fairness in any punishments.
Yeah, and there should be like a structure of how it should be done.
Okay, so let's take each of these. We've got 5, it's enough to get started. So if you didn't, well, we don't want to deal with arbitrary use of corporal punishment and abuse of power by teachers who just had a fucking bad day and want to spank some kids. Okay? So how do we stop that?
Create a structure to it.
Sorry?
Create a structure to it that we can't
like a spanking framework?
Yes, a chain of command that has to go to
chain of
Okay, something that has to go through the action. Like how it has been previously implemented in schools, where it has to go through principal or something.
Okay, so you're saying there should be like a second opinion, right? Some sort of, should be a second opinion, someone who wasn't directly involved in angry. And you're saying there should be clearly prescribed actions and punishments, right?
Have someone else doing the actioning.
Ooh, I like it. So, you're saying, let's not get the angry teacher who actually really wants to kill the kid to do it. Let's get someone dispassionate. Okay. What else? Okay, what about this thing about psych trauma? They're being humiliated in front of their peers, spanked in the front of the classroom. Separate room. Separate room. Okay, spanking room. Now wait a second. Yeah, because our spanking room might have just created this problem. But if we make sure spanking room plus 2 people at all times.
Well.
I think we're learning.
We're getting closer. Yeah. What else?
I mean, would it help, say, if you used electric shocks that could be clearly...
you say some type of measurable
for certain punishment.
A robotic.
Some kind of measured punishment.
Terrible people.
Non-flesh punishment. Okay. So, anyway. And what about the fact that it just might be overused? Or unfair over
Could
time?
you get parents to witness it?
You could, but that might be psychologically traumatic. You make that choice, right? So that's one of the things, as we're seeing here, the moment you start putting safeguards in, you risk creating more problems, right? So adding that private spanking room to get them away created problems of sexual abuse, so we needed to think of the 2 people. Going model crazy is not easy or a good idea in general, right? In general, you want as little as necessary to avoid having to defend things you don't think you should have to defend, right? You can't escape defending the core thing. So, I'll tell you what these guys did. They proposed, opening government, the world's grand final, they would reintroduce corporal punishment in schools. The punishment would be administered according to a strictly prescribed rule book that had clear types of offences that would be met with a certain number of spanks. Spanking would be administered in a private spanking room by a person other than the teacher who prescribed it, in the presence of a medically trained nurse, just a nurse, administered with a wooden spanking paddle that had been calibrated for weight and impact. Every week, all instances of spanking would be reviewed. So if there were cases where kids were falling afoul of spanking too often, that would be escalated to the principal and other measures would be shot. Okay. Now, is anything that unfair?
No.
Right? They're still defending hitting kids in a lot of cases and causing them pain. Right? That's the core of the case. They just said we don't have to defend sexual abuse. We don't have to have actually brutalizing kids. We just want to have a real plausible debate about a policy that could actually become something in the real world. And interestingly, they won that debate because everyone was taken by surprise and they didn't have no idea how to deal with it. But to me, this is the most extreme a model would ever get, right? But models do matter. And so just to think to yourself, think, oh gee, what are the things that we have to defend because we are actually proposing something? And what are the things we don't want to let the debate run away from us with? And those are the things you need to provide a model for, to be clear. Okay, last thing I want to talk about from the open part, wow, time flies, is characterization. So, characterization, I don't know if we talk about it a lot, it's kind of an implicit thing often rather than an explicit argument. All I'm going to do is put the word on the board so we don't get lost. So the best example of characterization that almost like just destroyed my whole team before we even started was Easter's in 2008. Someone from YouTube. Anyway, and the topic was that this house would allow private companies to sponsor science labs in schools. Was this 08 or 07 or 09?
I don't know, like we lost a UQ on eating disorders.
In the semi.
In the semi.
Yeah, no, this was round 1. Maybe it was
round 1 was against Melbourne.
Maybe it was 07.
How do you remember
that?
It was the highlights of my team. I spent 6 years trying to recreate.
Okay, maybe it was 07. Or 9. Anyway, and so they got up and they said, we're just in a country where, you know, half the state schools don't have functional science labs. We need this, right? I know it sounds crazy to let, you know, science companies, and we desperately, like private companies in to sponsor schools, but we desperately need it because we don't have science labs and we don't have science facilities. And I sat there for the first 5 minutes of that speech thinking, shit, like how can you actually make a case against that? Like if our kids are literally sitting there without facilities to learn and study, all my things about, oh, well, you're exposing them to corporate interests, kind of fall flat against, well, if we don't, they just won't learn anything. So where's their like free thinking job now? Right? It took me like till the 6-minute knock to suddenly realize, wait a second, that characterization of schools in Australia is false. And if it's not, then the solution could be an alternative solution, i.e. the government should put money into state schools, right? But that characterization of just how our schools were and how short-strapped the education system was powerful. And I fell into it, even though I was on the opposition team, right? And it wasn't until I realized, no, I actually just have to get up and challenge that characterization and say, firstly, that's not a fair characterization of the majority of schools in Australia. Secondly, if it is, the solution is government putting money in. I couldn't even think about how to run an opposition case that actually worked, right? And this is something that you're probably not consciously aware of a lot of the time. But the reason good teams win big is because they just own these characterizations of how the world is in such a way that all their arguments fit better in their version of the world, and your arguments somehow just don't quite fit as well in their version of the world. So some debates make this characterization stuff really explicit. So while we're mining euros, we already talked about... okay, so this house believes that the Muslim Brotherhood should sincerely offer to cease resistance, participate in elections, and respect a liberal constitution. Can anyone sense there's a characterization here that might shape which side of the debate is going to have an easier time? Who's the key actor here? The Muslim Brotherhood. What do the Muslim Brotherhood want?
Sharia law.
Caliphate. Okay, so what I've heard from one is we've got the Muslim Brotherhood wants Sharia law and Islamic caliphate throughout the world. Who has a different view of what the Muslim Brotherhood wants?
They want solid rights for the Egyptian people, they want jobs, they want fair oil prices, fair food prices, they want a functioning state in which people can live in their religion and practice in peace rather than under the brutal regime of a military dictatorship.
Cool. Now, sometimes these things are arguments, And sometimes they don't immediately crop up as arguments, because you sit there in a debate and you think, well, I know who I think the Muslim Brotherhood are. So I'm going to run arguments about how them either getting in the elections or not is good for their interests. But sometimes we don't explicitly recognize that our version of what the Muslim Brotherhood want and the other team's version of the Muslim Brotherhood want might be different. Right? And a really good team will get up here, and what do you think they're going to do from Gov? Which characterization do you think they want the adjudicator to believe about the Muslim Brotherhood if they're proposing that they should cease resistance, participate in elections, and respect liberal constitution?
Andrews.
Yes.
Yeah. Andrews.
Right.
Characterization.
Andrews, because can you see if the adjudicator believes that that's who the Muslim Brotherhood are, it'll be much easier to show how they achieve those goals by participating. What do you think a smart neg would like to characterize the Muslim Brotherhood as? Yeah, you maybe don't have to go quite that far. But at least far enough to say that there are some values in there that are fundamentally incompatible with secular democracy. Right? And if you win that characterization, the arguments on your side of the debate fit easier. Right? But so often in debates, you don't actually explicitly think about who we're characterizing here. Right? It's like debates about feminism. What do women want? What is the feminist movement? Are women all the same? Do they all want the same thing? Okay.
Just talk me in.
Nice, good ingredients.
Yes.
Come on, guys, it's funny.
And yeah, who's been in a debate where about feminism or women's rights or something, and the debate's been about which policy better achieves this view of women's rights without actually just questioning, wait, women aren't all the same. Not all women want the same thing. Have you been in debates where that never came up? Yeah? Yeah? Right? The team that can recognize that and flip it and recharacterize the actors is going to do really well, because you can shift the whole ground of the debate to be more on your side. And you can do the same thing in IR debates as well, right? So owning the characterization of how people will act, right? A debate about I don't know, something to do with China. How China actually will act and what drives China becomes a very important characterization when you're thinking about whether certain things are threatening or not. Right? So recognizing those underlying characterizations and owning them is powerful. A great example was a debate, chemical castration of rapists. We did training a few weeks ago. Right? And there was this wasn't a great debate, but one team was literally characterizing rapists as, look, you can't punish people for something that's just a crime of passion. Right? Now,
Beavis, you should be happy about that. We'll come back to serve you well one day.
Is the argument there is the argument the argument they made was we shouldn't chemically castrate people. We shouldn't use such a harsh punishment for people who commit a crime of passion. So you could just respond to the argument, right? You should say, well, crime of passion shouldn't be a serious offense. Crime of passion shows that you've got no control over yourself, whatever, and you still hurt someone, victims' rights, whatever. You respond to the argument. Or what else could you do?
Characterization of rape.
What else is there?
A crime of power and domination, not of passion.
Yeah, right. So the majority of rape is not, I just saw this woman in a short skirt and I couldn't control myself because it was like a slab of meat, right? That's the argument that they're effectively making by saying it's a crime of passion, right? So you've got to tear that out, pick it out, and point out just how ludicrous that is, and that the majority of what's actually is rape is about premeditated use of power, exertion. You know, this is not something we should be, rebut the argument too, right? Like the premeditation or crime of passion, whatever. But go for the characterization, because if you get that, then it shifts the grounds on which the arguments sit.
Yeah. How do you usually present characterizations if it's a characterization that's going to be central to the debate? Do you present it as an argument or this like long part of your introduction? Your thoughts of what do you usually do?
That's a great question. I'm curious. I think It depends. So if it's a very complicated characterization, often it's just an argument, and it's not an argument. I make it as an argument because I want to show all the links to own that characterization, even though it's not immediately obvious that I've made an argument that earns any points. Right? So imagine if you're in a rape case and you get up in the first point, it's just kind of say, let's be clear about why the vast majority of rapes occur and the kind of people who do it. You go through and you spend 30 seconds to a minute explaining that in a lot of detail. You haven't actually made an argument, because in and of itself it doesn't push people either way, but it does ground your characterization very strongly. So in a debate where you think that characterization is important, I think, yes, spend your 30 seconds, spend your minute, actually do it explicitly and just own it. Because you then still need to make great arguments. But if you own that, then your arguments sit better. In other debates, it won't be such a big thing. You just use it in rebuttal. I mean, rebuttal is usually the easiest time to do it, right? Someone said some gross mischaracterization. You just get up and say, bullshit! Right? Maybe with those sort of functions, okay. Anyway.
Not when you use it.
Thanks. But rebuttal's a great time to clarify. Or actually, one of the best times to do it is your opening, right? So if a characterization is going to be something in a debate that actually shifts how all the arguments sit, the best time to deal with that is right at the start when you have everyone's attention, right? Just call it out. We just had a team who tried to tell you that rapists should be forgiven because they're just uncontrollable crimes of passion. That's rubbish. That's apologist for rapists. You don't deserve it. This is crimes of power. This is people dominating women, premeditated fashion. They don't deserve any sympathy from the state for the fact that they can't keep it in their hands. Right? Because if their jollies come from inflicting suffering on others, that's not forgivable. That's not empathizable. That's not cool. Right? So just deal with that up front. And then go through. So keeping that in mind, let's go back to their arguments. And then you can rebut them on your thing. Alright. Any thoughts on that?
I think you're right.
Okay. Next, what time's pizza?
Arriving at 6:15.
6:15, sweet. So we will do one last thing, which is the stuff about getting the clash or the killer argument. Okay, so when you're in prep, you really do need something. Sacrificial lots, right?
That's what it's good for.
Okay, so what do you do in prep? How do you come up with arguments right now?
Do you know what it is?
Through the power of my mind. Yes, so one thing, brainstorm or mind map. Right? You just let the juices flow. Stop. We moved on. In case you didn't realize, to re-characterize, we are now talking about
nail down the characterization, how strong, how weak you want to get.
Yeah, so we're going to think about our line, our model, all this stuff.
Like, in a very sunlight kind of way, just really nail down who are you.
Yes, who are you? Good. Think about who you are.
You've learnt well.
Who am I? But be careful, if you spend too much time thinking who am I, you might get stuck in a philosophical black hole.
Never.
But, okay, great. So these are two ways of coming up with arguments, right? The first one said is brainstorm, see what comes naturally. It's going to be great for getting a lot of arguments out quickly, but the thing you won't know from that is how relevant those arguments are when you try to should always do it. This thing about asking who am I, if you can work out where you are on a first principles kind of spectrum, right? Oh, this is a debate about criminal justice, and I'm the pro-deterrent retribution victims justice side, as opposed to the kind of happy-go-lucky, rehabilitation, perpetrators justice. Anyway, whatever. That's going to already tell you some of the kind of arguments you are. So yeah, if you recognize, for those who've taught first principles or whatever, where you are on a first principles spectrum, or which philosopher you are, or which, I'm a bit of a utilitarian in this case, so I kind of know the arguments that are going to have to go with that case. That's going to be relevant. What else can you do? How else can you come up with arguments?
Potential counter arguments and work backwards.
Cool. Like that one. So this is what Fee used to call strength and steel. So,
Sounds like a weightlifting technique.
yeah. Find an argument on the other side. Own it. So, if we took a topic like, so kind of what we were talking about before, this house.
Say a word.
A word. Okay, so let's do celebrating female. No, we've had too much sex in this room so far. So let's do the one about voting, right? So having a citizenship test in order to get voting, right? You're sitting on the neg, right? And you realize, well, the AF is going to say that having mass participation makes politics dumber, right? Can we actually run that argument kind of on our side, right? And say, no, actually having a citizenship test will make politics dumber. Anyone think how to do it? I mean, civics test. Yeah.
Well, if it's a test about that gives particular people more voting power depending on their knowledge about particular issues, then it could concentrate political power in such ways to make politics actually not only less representative but also dumber in a sense. Because fewer people have control over more.
Yup. What else is the test actually testing?
Yeah, it depends what it tests.
Yeah. Right? So it could be that what you'll get is lots of people who are party hacks. Who the Gov already thought was a problem, right? The party hacks went to polls and find everything. You're saying, well, now people that Gov is going to give more votes to are the people who love the political system, total hacks. They know all about civics and citizenship. So you might actually be taking votes away from scientists, engineers, really clever, brainy people who just didn't want to give their lives to like the minutiae and procedures of Parliament. Right? So you think about these things and you can take that argument that was going to sit on the other side and say, no, we're not letting you have that. That's ours. Thank you very much. Pull it over. And that's linked to what we would call a wish list. So who's come across a Sonrakian wish list? Okay, what is a wish list?
What would we like to be able to prove?
What would we like to be able to prove? Good. So let's say classic, but nice introduction for people that this house supports child labour. What would you really like to be able to show?
That it's good for the children.
Good for the children. Okay. Wish list. Child labour is good for the children. Quick hands up. Who thinks it's possible?
Ooh.
Who thinks it's not possible?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we've got a few. Alright. So, child labour is good for the kid because in the country where we have countries where we have child labour, without child labour we're going to starve in the streets. Let's be realistic for a second. Characterization, grounded. Right? Child labour happens in the poorest parts of India. Happens in the poorest parts of the poorest countries in the world. There's no safety in it. There's no welfare that they should be sitting at home sharing with their parents. It's not like their parents are working most of the time. It's often the kids are earning to support their disabled parents or parents who can't get jobs. It's not like they're meant to be in school because the school won't teach them jack shit anyway. So quite frankly, if you don't let them work, they're going to starve to death and probably so will their families and dependent siblings as well. Right? That's one way child labour is good for the child. The second reason child labour is good for the child is they actually get a chance to learn something that will help them out in life, as opposed to a school being taught by illiterate teachers who don't know anything, who don't show up, who don't spend time. It's actually much better to be realist and accept, yeah, they're not going to be university professors, but they're at least going to gain skills in a job that can see them through life. By the time they hit adulthood, they will be serious, trained professionals in what they do. Good for kids. Anyone skeptical might have changed their vote?
How do you deal with the issue that most of this child labour is actually manual work?
Is what?
Manual labour.
What's so bad about manual labour? Keep them healthy, much better than sitting in front of a computer.
I'd say the argument child labour is the best of a bad bunch, because it's not child labour, it's child prostitution, it's issues with like, recently the boy in China had his eyelids cut off, his retina cut off, so things around that. So
right. Wow. Organising.
organ harvesting or child prostitution.
Yeah. So I think the point I want to make with wish list is you'll surprise yourself. Often you can come up with something that you would really like to be able to prove, and if you don't stop it before you have a chance to think about it, you'll actually be able to find a way to prove it. And the power of a kind of wish list approach as opposed to brainstorming is that if you do manage to prove those things, you know they're relevant, right? Because you've chosen the things that you really wish you could prove, because if you could prove it, you probably wouldn't, right? People would really care. And so having that kind of filter as well and thinking, what are the things that would actually really change people's minds, is a great way to make sure what was on the board earlier, that you make sure you pick arguments that are really centered and are really relevant. And I'm going to nail it in case. Just for the sake of generating arguments, how else can we come up with arguments? One more.
Stakeholders.
Stakeholders. Eat my steak.
Thank you for that, Victor.
Pleasure. Okay, so stakeholders as opposed to shareholders. Stakeholders are anyone who has any interest in anything to do with the topic. So, have some people not seen stakeholder before? Okay, in brief, stakeholder is think about the people who are affected by a topic. So let's say we had the aid referendum one, that aid should be given except with referendum. Who would have an interest in that topic? Yeah?
People getting aid.
Okay, so aid recipients? Yeah, and are they just one block?
Government and individual. Government.
Okay, so they might split by country in some contexts, yeah?
They might also split in terms of those who are getting aid now, those who would continue getting aid under either model, and those who would get aid only under the new model.
So you might have aid recipients from countries that happen to share the same skin colour kind of affiliation, so most people would probably referendum out of parochialism, and then you'd have the people who actually really need it, who don't get it. Let's see how I would want to characterise that, depending on the side. Yep. Of course. Yeah, so citizens, we could split them up in, we'll say citizen taxpayers in general. But we could split up into, maybe we split citizens into taxpayers and welfare recipients. Because who are our aid recipients directly competing against? Well, that's a trick question, they're not directly competing against. But if you wanted to characterise it that way, you certainly could. Right, so you can kind of go through and say, well, we've got these people, what are the arguments associated with each of them? Right, so what's the argument if you're on the pro-referenda side, don't let that aid get out of the country without a referendum? What's the argument for the welfare recipient?
They're not getting enough committees, they're shit like it wants it.
They'll get more.
Sorry?
And they will get more.
They'll get more. Why could you make the argument that they are actually linked kind of one-to-one to the international aid recipient money?
You can say that you're diverting resources.
Yep. So definitely diverting resources.
The average taxpayer only has like a limited amount of goodwill for giving their tax dollars away to disadvantage.
Ah, I like it. Right, so you're saying a certain amount of budget will go to disadvantaged people, whether they're in the country or outside. Because at the end of the day, people want to see a certain share of their tax money reinvested in services that actually benefit them. So in that sense, there is actually a direct competition between our local poor and our international poor, and therefore their interest really matters. Cool. What did we do there in that argument, by the way? What did we add layers of?
Assumptions.
Right. Taxpayers? Yeah. Actually, we did that they'll only give a limited amount of their money to charitable causes. Do you think that's true? Do you think most taxpayers actually think about that?
It depends on how.
Yeah, it depends. You can characterize it either way. It's crazy about debate. But I think really key is if you're doing stakeholder type thing, go back to original arguments 101, right? And this is the last thing I'll just say, is that everything we've talked about opening government, right? About having a really powerful opening that grounds you in context, about having a clear line, a precise model, hitting the core arguments. At the end of the day, it still just comes down to can you make the arguments you make really work, right? Because it is still at the end of the day debating. Quiz, what are the elements of a good argument?
Material analysis and evidence.
And a link, that's right.
A link. right? Good argument will have all the logic as to why everything flows and why it's true, and why it's relevant and why we care. Okay? That's statement, the analysis, and the evidence. Now, just going back to it, because sometimes when you start branching out for more creative arguments or your wish list, it becomes easy to miss some of those key links because you're stretching. Right? And it's precisely when you're stretching emoji that you have to make them the most. Because there's one other way that the debate gets away from you. You hit all the right ideas, and then closing gets up there, and then put all the missing links in. Right? And they get up and say, opening gov was totally right. We agree with everything they were trying to do. We know the opposition showed why they were wrong and couldn't prove anything they said, but luckily we can actually prove why they were right. Right? If your closing team can prove those missing links for you, they're like superheroes. Right? So it's really important that you push yourself in prep to find all those links and follow it all the way through. So this one about the welfare recipients, why they would have a say, why we care about them. Right? We had to get to that link of saying there's a limited pool of funds that a government will spend on benevolent ends. If you don't make that link through there, there's not really a clear one-to-one link between welfare recipients in the country and potential aid recipients externally. So you make this really nice sounding argument, but it doesn't stick. Right? And that's when that'll get taken away from you. So really pushing yourself with that is really important. And of course the last thing then is teamwork. So this kind of stuff about pushing yourself, the links, the why and prep, the person who's going to see the gaps in it is going to be your teammate the most, right? When you trade the idea back and forward, you're going to need to develop and find as you go through debating a way that you can critique constructively each other's arguments in prep without kind of being the obstructionist. No, why? 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 No, why? Why is that relevant? Why is that true? That's really annoying. But finding something in between is really powerful. And on the line of teamwork, as Pete says, that can happen. Points of information. What happens after the Prime Minister sits down from opening go? What do you do if you're the Prime Minister? Are you done? So,
you look on your phone, right? You go on Facebook? Is that the answer? Yeah, you start texting your girlfriend? Yeah.
So,
down
pat. So during your op leader speech, I recommend you become your deputy slave. I don't know if you've ever actually had a chat. Some of you definitely would have done a lot of wrong stuff, but for those who haven't, ever chatted with or thought about for yourself, when I'm the next person to speak, what do I actually need from my teammate? Right? Because I guarantee you it's impossible to give an incredible speech using only your brain alone. Right? Some people, you've got to know this for yourself, some people like to get told rebuttals, right? They hear something, the teammate has an idea, they whisper it to them, they're happy and they got it. Some people get distracted if they hear someone missing, lose chain of thought, so they want it written down, right? Some people are happy just to have written down the response. Others can't place the response without the point that it was responding to, right? So my preference always was actually I needed my teammate to write down this was the point they made, and this is our response to it, and give me that clearly written on a piece of paper. And then I could use it, right? You start thinking, you can actually say, wow, I need to listen to this argument that he's saying at the moment, but I don't have the response to the previous argument. So teammate, hey, can you think of an argument in response to that argument and give it to me in a minute when this argument's over, right? You need to, because at opening gov, you have that one chance to rebut case. So you need to make sure that that deputy speech is loaded with as much killer rebuttal as you can think of. And that means finding a way to use both of your brains, right, in that space. And really what that comes down to is, if you're speaking deputy, start experimenting for yourself with what way you like getting information. And it sounds, like weird to have a little team chat, but it's something you can talk about with someone you're debating with before or after the debate. Even if it's just a practice debate, just to say, can I ask you in the debate to write me a rebuttal for something, right? Because if you haven't asked and you just say, write me this bitch, then people will be like, whoa, what up? Video camera dead. And then of course that teamwork just flows through. Once the opening two speakers are finished, you're a POI team. That's all you do, right? Killer POIs together. Share it, refine it, craft it like a little baby. And I hope that you get it in and nail it.
It's just...
Stop. So, pizza clock. Questions over pizza? Do you like?
Good on. That's hilarious. Meat lovers.